today's video, I want to talk about probably what I would consider the most famous Ford tractor of all time, and that's the Ford 8N. In order to get here, I got to do a little bit of a history and backtrack a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'll give you a little bit of history of Ford's tractor business, including the Fordson just a little bit in order to get you up here. And I've got a lot of literature and some videos to show you, so hopefully this will be something entertaining for you. And if you're a Ford fan like I am, I hope that you'll enjoy it. Growing up as kind of a farm kid, basically there were three tractor manufacturers that people had around here, and if you didn't have that, whatever you had was a laughing stock. So the tractors pretty much were Ford, John Deere, and IH. Obviously, there were Alice Chalmers people and Massey people, but there were very few and far in between. The Ford tractors were always something I was interested in. And Henry Ford, obviously everybody knows about Henry Ford. One of his first experiences with a tractor was on his way into Detroit in a buggy with his father when he was a kid, and there was a big steam traction engine at work on the road. So Henry was able to get out and get a ride on it and check it out, and then he made a model of it that worked. So he grew up on a farm, and farming life he knew was hard, and he always kept the farmers in the back of his mind. And even though he was an automobile mogul, still in the back of his mind was trying to come up with a way to make farm life simpler. So some of his first inventions were basically modifications of the Model T Ford car or the TT truck. In fact, if I can find it, there's a picture of my grandfather at the house with his Model T jacked up, and they had a belt on the back end of the Model T connected to a buzz saw to saw wood. A lot of people would figure out how to drag farm implements behind their Model Ts. In fact, before my dad bought a Farmall, he just took a Model A truck and connected two transmissions together. If I can find that picture of that Model A homemade tractor, or some people call them a doodle bug, but Dad had it was a shortened Model A. They cut the frame, shortened it up, and basically took everything off except the motor and the fenders pretty much, and put some chains on the back, and then they just dragged horse-drawn implements. So that was Dad's first tractor, and it had two transmissions put together. So Dad told me one time he would put it in low, and then he had a trailer hook to the back, so he would basically start the tractor towards one end of the field, jump in the back of the trailer with a shovel and spread manure, and then when he get to close to the other end, he'd get off and jump back on and turn the other way. So that was pretty much the way it was. Ford was I like to use the word wily. He was very clever. He was always trying to figure out ways to improve. And one of Ford's sayings was, "You find the laziest person and put them on a task, and they will figure out the easiest way to do it." And I've found that to be true as a supervisor in the military for a number of years. You just find the laziest person, tell them to go get this figured out, and they will invariably figure out a shortcut way that probably is sufficient and get it done. So that was one of Henry Ford's philosophies. So Henry was a pretty smart guy. At one point, there was a company, I think it was in Minneapolis. They knew about Ford, and they thought they had a way to make some money off Ford's, maybe do some extortion. So Ford kind of circumvented that and avoided paying any royalties to these people. The Ford shareholders were kind of impatient with Henry because he spent a lot of time and a lot of money dabbling with tractors. In fact, before the Fordson came out, I think he spent over $500,000. And so what Ford did is he kind of put out some rumors that maybe he was going to stop making cars or something. So the stock dropped, and then Henry bought up all the shares, so he had the sole ownership of the company. Then he could do whatever he wanted, and Ford owned all the stock for quite a while. So, but that's a story for another day. So anyway, in 1915 or so, there was a guy named Farkas that was working with Ford, and they made a lot of these designs, and they started really coming out around 1917, and they sent a bunch of them to England. And the reason they sent them over there was because World War I had broken out, and all the horses were taken off the farms and sent to the front to haul artillery and supplies and whatnot. So they needed something to replace the horses. And yeah, they had some oxen and some mules, but mostly the horses were gone, and that's what they used. So Ford, with Farkas, they made a whole bunch of these. I think they made 10 different versions, two of each version, sent them over there for testing, and ultimately there was one of these that came out. Now this one's a little bit newer. It's got 7 spokes on it. The first one had 6, and the first one had like a ladder here, and this one's solid. So there were some design changes. And before the Model A came out, Ford had made the Rouge plant, which was going to be for the Model A. And Ford wanted the space for the Model A. So basically all the Fordson tractor manufacturing was sent over to England and Ireland. And there were different variations of the Ford tractor, the Fordson. They came out until 1946 when the Ford Major and the Super Major and all those different English ones came out. Eventually, they all just became one company. But for a while, he was kind of running two separate companies, one in Europe, England, and one in Ireland, which was kind of the same, and the one here. Ford tractors were made in Dearborn, and so therefore a lot of the implements were called Dearborn implements. So the Fordson that went to England eventually, and it went to Cork first, but then it went to Dagenham, England. Originally they were around 20 horsepower, and then before the end of the run, they were up to around 30, but they were also a lot heavier. So one of the design, I call it the design flaw of these tractors, is that they had a worm drive through the transmission, and so it generated a lot of heat. And therefore, if you were sitting on the seat of the tractor, your butt got pretty warm after a while because of the worm drive. Because of the heat generated, that was dissipating horsepower. So if you had 20 horsepower coming out of the motor, by the time it went through this worm drive out the back, you probably had 10. Ford didn't design any implements to go with this. They basically just made the tractor. So what was pretty common at the time, and in fact even up through the 70s when I was a kid, people were still taking horse-drawn implements and putting, an iron pole or the wooden pole and just putting a clevis on it and hooking it to the drawbar and pulling it. And in fact, some of my earliest memories, we didn't have an actual mounted plow. We had a walk-in plow. So we'd had the tractor with a chain, and I remember my dad standing behind the walk-in plow, walking the plow down. So that was pretty common. And the problem with that is the way that these got traction was they would take a chain and hook it up higher. They wouldn't hook it on the drawbar necessarily. They would hook it up higher on the axle. And that, therefore, when you were pulling ahead, and let's say the plow encountered an object like heavy soil, for example, it would pull down, and that would pull down. The force would pull down on the back of the tractor and give it more traction. Well, the downfall of that, the downside, is that these iron wheels, they didn't slip, and what would happen more frequently than not is when that happened, you couldn't push the clutch in fast enough, and you would end up rolling the whole thing over. In fact, it happened really quickly. And these tractors didn't have a brake. They had a clutch and a 3-speed transmission, and they sold quite a few of them, but by the mid-teens, IHC was being a pretty good competitor, and especially around 1923 when the Farmall Regular came out, they started to lose a lot of market space in the United States, because in the United States we primarily sold corn, cotton, a lot of wheat, but row crop tractors, once they figured out that the Farmall Regular, with its ability to straddle rows and see the crop, and then they had the Farmall A in 1939 with the Cultivision, these really lost a lot of favor. So by the mid-20s, Ford had sent these to England, and he concentrated on his Model A's. There were some guys. They were the Sherman Brothers, and I'm sure that sounds familiar to some of you. So the Sherman Brothers were friends of Ford, and they kept in touch with him for quite a while, and they continued to import these tractors from Europe, and they kept dabbling with adapting attachments and selling them. So they still had a good dealership network, and still there were some Ford tractors being sold, but not that many. They were mostly internationals were being sold at the time. Also around that time was a man named Harry Ferguson, and Harry Ferguson had this plow design that he had made, and he kept trying to find a tractor manufacturer to work with him to put his patented plow hitch design on their tractor. And he was able to convince the Brown company, which later became David Brown, not to be confused with David Bradley, but David Brown. So they had this Brown Ferguson tractor, or Ferguson Brown tractor, that looked a little bit like this, but looked to me kind of like one of those race cars from the 30s. So at one point, Harry Ferguson was able to get the attention of Henry Ford, and they went to Henry Ford's farm. And ironically, on Henry Ford's farm, he not only did he have a Fordson tractor on the farm, but he had an Alice Chalmers B. That Alice Chalmers B was one thing I want to talk about that I forgot, is these tractors had the engine, transmission, and rear end all bolted together. There wasn't a frame. You've seen like a WD-45, or maybe like some of the old Titans and Moguls, and even the IHC 1530, they had an actual frame. Well, Ford was able to basically be a pioneer in not having a frame on the tractors. So Ferguson showed Henry his plow on that Ferguson Brown tractor, and it was able to outpull both the Fordson and the Alice using a similar plow. And so what he had is he had this patented system called the 3-point hitch. And what it did is it was the attachment points would be up further up front, as you can see here. And what that did is it basically was pulling from more of the center of the tractor. So when you were pulling and let's say it hit an object, it was able to use this top link to force the front of the tractor down. So this design actually it would outpull. It had more traction because it was pulling the back end down, like I showed you in the other one, but it was also preventing it from rearing over. So the design was pretty good, but Ferguson didn't have a person to attach that design to. So after they had the demonstration, Henry and Harry got together and they had what they called the handshake agreement. Basically, either one could get out of it at any time for any reason, whatever. And what they were going to do is Henry was going to make the tractors and Harry was going to do the implements. Henry Ford sold these tractors to Harry at a fixed price, but Harry was able to set the price to his dealer. So as the design of the 9N was coming out, and so I'm talking a little bit ahead of myself when I'm talking about the 9N here. The 9N came out in 1939. In 1938 in October was when they had their handshake agreement. And so the 9N was the first one that came out. It looked a lot like this, and I'll get to the specifics here in a second. But basically what was happening during the design phase of the 9N was that the patents that were being filed in Harry's name because Henry didn't care about patents. He didn't think they mattered. So Harry was getting all the patents for the tractor in his name. He was getting all the measurements, the specifications, and everything, basically so he could recreate this tractor in a different factory with his name on it and not Ford's. So basically one of the things that Henry was trying to do is he was trying to get a tractor out there. He was trying to garner the market. There were a lot of people making tractors in the late 30s, a lot of companies, and Henry wanted to put them out of business. He wanted to be the guy. So he was able to make this tractor for sale for like $585 or $600. It was really ridiculous. And none of the other competitors really were in a position to offer their tractors that low, so a lot of them folded. International came out with a plan with their 1530. They were matching the price. They were doing a lot to keep focused on it. John Deere had their A and the B that came out in 1939 as well. So there was some competition. There was some solid competition, but a lot of the competition went away because they couldn't match this price. The 9N tractor was made between 1939 and 1942. Like I said, it looked a lot like this tractor, but it had a 3-speed transmission, and the hubs are huge on them, and I'll show you a picture of that. To be honest with you, I think the 9N is ugly. I don't like it. And I know it looks a lot like this tractor, but it just doesn't look like this tractor enough to me, so I don't like it. But anyway, a lot of you will like it, and that's your prerogative. You know, you like what you like. But I don't like them. They had a 3-speed transmission, had the funky looking wheels. 3-point hitch only had a one position on the top for the top link. There wasn't any running boards. They had the brakes, one on each side, so it was really difficult to, like, how do you push the clutch in and push both brakes down at the same time? So that was a weird thing. Initially, what they did was they would make design changes before the next model year. Sometimes there were some things that came up that warranted a mid-year change, and one of them was they initially had the key switch and the starter on the dash, and I think it was around 1940 or 1941. One of the employees somehow managed to start the tractor with it in gear, and I don't know if he got hurt, but that's what happened. And Henry found out about it, and he said he didn't ever want that to happen to a customer. So they figured out how to make a neutral switch lockout on these, so you cannot start this tractor unless it's in neutral. You can push on the starter, but nothing's going to happen. And that was really preemptive to a lot of the tractors that came out. I can't think of another tractor. I'm sure there probably is, but I cannot think of another make and model tractor that has a neutral lockout that's this old. It was something that came out later. So basically this was one of the earliest safety features on tractors that you just can't start it and run over yourself. You have to put it in neutral, then you can start it. So the ridiculously low price of these, Ford wasn't making any money. Harry Ferguson was making money because he was getting the tractors cheap and setting the price, and so he was making okay, but Henry Ford was not. And in 1941, obviously World War I broke out, so for the 1942 year, Ford came out with the 2N, so the 39, 9N, 42, 2N. So even though the 2N and 9N are similar, technically the 9N was only built 3 years, 39, 40, 41, and then the 2N was built 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, and 47. There were a lot of updates, and they took it as far as they could before they came out with a new design in 1947 to release the 1948 Model 8N, which is this tractor. The 2N was a stripped down version of the 9N. It was very similar. You know, one of the selling points, one of the things that Ford wanted on the 9N was he wanted people to be able to push a button and start the tractor, whereas in a lot of those older tractors you had to crank them because they had a magneto. It was going to have a battery, a distributor ignition, electric start motor, and also the crank if you needed it. But Henry wanted it to be easy to start the tractor, so that was one of the really big selling points of the 9N. In 1942, because of the war shortage, the material shortages, Henry came out with a new tractor called the 2N. He knew that because if you introduced a new model during the war, you could change the price, but if you were just continuing with an existing model, you can't. So he was able to, in 1942, make the 2N, and I think it was about $1,200 or something like that for that tractor. You know, for only about a year or so, they had the steel wheels on them, but very quickly he was able to get them on rubber. Henry made the argument that, you know, we need to make tractors, we need to get tractors out, food is necessary, so we need to keep doing this. And he was able to convince the war board to let him put rubber tires back on. And but they still had the magneto, all those things. Now, if you know anything about magnetos, you know, if you're not timed right, crank it, it can kick back and hurt you. Magnetos, they're great if you know how to take care of them, but a lot of people weren't taking care of them. So they were really pushing to get the 9N out for sale. The design for the hood, for the metal hood, so they weren't quite ready yet. So there was quite a few that came out early on, the early 1939s, that had a chrome or aluminum hood on them. And I don't know how many there were, maybe a few hundred, 700. I don't remember exactly, but some of you probably do. But they were aluminum, and obviously they dented easily. So as soon as the new tooling was ready for the metal, they were replaced. But if you do have a 9N with aluminum hood, it's kind of a unique unicorn. Henry had plans for his son Edsel, which was why they called it Ford and Son. But during the World War I, they were trying to shorten names of everything. So instead of Ford and Son, it was just shortened to Fordson. After Henry passed away, Henry's grandson, Henry Ford II, had taken the reins of the Ford Motor Company, and he knew that they were losing money by providing tractors to Harry Ferguson. And so what he did is he broke the handshake agreement, and they came out with this tractor called the 8N. And there were a lot of improvements. There were a lot of refinements from the 9N, the 2N over its history that were incorporated, but the 8N in all was a new tractor. You had a 4-speed transmission, you had running boards, you had the brakes on one side, so you could have independent brakes, you could push the clutch in, hit both brakes. It had a different draft control on it, so it had position and draft control, where the 9N and 2N, you basically pulled the lever up and it was up, pushed the lever down, it was down. It wasn't really position control. And that was the case with a lot of hydraulics back then. I don't know about the Jubilee, but I know up until at least the Jubilee, headlights were an option. They had battery ignition, but headlights were a dealer installed option. So you could get the headlights, you could get the tail lights, the work light. There were a lot of extra options. There was this jack hooked to a 3-point hitch that would jack the back of the tractor up using the 3-point hitch, which was pretty neat. There were air pumps. A lot of aftermarket companies, seized upon the opportunity to make attachments that would fit the Ford tractor. So there's a lot of those, and in fact, I'll show you what I can think of. So of course, while I'm trying to make the video, I can't quite put my hands on all the tools, but these tractors came with a tool kit. There were 2 open-end box wrenches. There was this plow wrench, which would help you adjust the plow. Some of them, a little bit later on, they came out with this wrench here. There was a monkey wrench and the screwdriver, and I've got the pliers somewhere. I can't remember where I put them. There was these pliers, these slip joint pliers, and they had a screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver here. And trying to set the points with this or this seems pretty prohibitive. I don't know how they did it, but that's what came with the tractor. Came with a toolbox. The toolbox is up under here, and these were the tools that you got with it. Better picture of the tool set. Maybe some of you have these tools. And like I said, there's 2 open-end wrenches, kind of like this one, but smaller. And they were able to, you could do the lug nuts and everything with it. And I'll put a picture of that up, as well as a lot of the extra aftermarket parts that you could buy, a lot of the dealer supplied parts and options that you could buy for these tractors. These were a great little tractor, and a lot of people I knew growing up, they had a Farmall or a John Deere tractor as their primary big tractor, and they had one of these as a utility tractor for like tedding and raking hay. Kind of were a problem sometimes because the muffler was underneath the floorboards. So I guess I had an issue with people setting their hay fields on fire. The Jubilee, the muffler was up under the hood, but the tailpipe was still there, so it was still hot. were a vertical stack option, which I'm working on the Jubilee. It was just it was a good tractor, and a couple of the drawbacks I think of the 8N. One of them being that the only way the 3-point hitch works is you have to put the PTO on. So with this tractor, in order to use the 3-point hitch, you had to push the clutch in, you had to activate the PTO on the back, and then you could use the hydraulics. Every time you push the clutch in, because the hydraulics were back here, you disengaged the driveline and the hydraulics stopped. So that's probably what I would call the biggest drawback of this tractor, is that the hydraulics are great. You had to do some fancy footwork to push the clutch in, put it in neutral in order to like use your attachments. Unless you were just, you know, going through and picking up and then turning around and coming back, it was fine. If you had to stop at the end, pick something up, you really had to stop at the end. You couldn't just drive through. You know, you get the picture. I think the second thing that I think is a drawback about these is reverse is the same as third forward. So it's crazy backwards. You have to ride the clutch really to make it, you know, if you want to back in somewhere or back a trailer up, it was kind of difficult if you're going that fast. I could make a whole video about all the design changes of the 8N, and feel free to comment on some of the ones that I'm not going to get to telling you about, but some of the bigger ones. 48, 49, they had the distributor in the front, and it's a coil. The coil's kind of square. You know what I mean if you have one of these. It's not too bad to work on. A lot of people will just take the whole distributor off, tune it up, and put it back on. But it's a little bit prohibitive to work on. So Ford later on designed it to put the distributor over on the side, and over on the side, and they moved the muffler to the other side. The generator got moved. There were some seal updates. Let's see, that later on the proof meter was installed, and what the proof meter is, it just basically gives you your hours on the tractor. It tells you the speed you're going in each gear, and it's kind of a neat rig. I'll show you a picture of one of those if I think of it. So let me see if I can think of some of the other options real quick that were changed, or things that were changed. Let's see, the recirculating ball steering was different. The emblem is different on this than the 9N, and I think they changed it from like chrome to embossed, and I can't remember which one this is. It's like an argent. It's not original. This tractor didn't have the emblem on the front, and I put it on because it looked naked without it. See this? Maybe the screen on the intake. If you are a Ford guy or a girl, you know better than me what some of the updates were and when they occurred. But the biggest ones to me, I think, were some of the seals, the generator, distributor, the ball steering. That's all I can think of off the top of my head without going and looking it up. So I know there were quite a few. So this tractor basically used Harry Ferguson's patents for the 3-point hitch. And like I said, even though it was a whole thing, it took a bunch of lawyers, and Ford ended up paying Harry Ferguson a big lawsuit over it because, of course, Harry sued it because his name wasn't on the tractor anymore. This was a different tractor. They were still using his patented thing. And as you remember, I told you Harry didn't let Ford have the patents. Henry didn't care. So all the patents were in Harry's name. And even though they both stood to gain off it, it was a debacle. It took a bunch of lawyers. A single judge decided the case in favor of Harry. And what ended up happening was, by 1952, they decided just to build a new tractor, which was the Jubilee behind me. So that resolved all the patent infringements. And it's a much better tractor in my mind, too. So the 9N, 2N, 8N are all pretty much the same horsepower, right around 23 horsepower-ish. And back in the 30s and 40s, there wasn't the established Nebraska tests yet, which became the gold standard. So every company would kind of like tell you what their own drawbar horsepower was, and eventually they were tested in Nebraska, but initially the companies would just say this is what it is. But they would test it on the drawbar and the belt pulley. The belt pulley is more equivalent to PTO horsepower than the drawbar horsepower is, because the drawbar horsepower is always going to be less. You're going to break traction before you'll use the full horsepower on the tractor in most cases. So around 24 horsepower. But the 8N sold for roughly 3 times, pretty close to 3 times what the original 9N sold for, which was $585, and then they were up to like $1,600. Like I said, after 3 years, 1942, it was like almost $1,200. But it was still an inexpensive tractor compared to a lot of the others. A lot of people swear by these for row crops, but they're not that great. And even though you can adjust the width out quite a ways, I think it's like 6 or 7 feet, you can bring it way out. And these were great for mowing. They were great for utility tractor, like spread manure, hauling wood and stuff. Even plowing and disking, they weren't too bad. But when it came to like row crops, like cultivating corn, because they're low and it's kind of hard to see, whereas the farmers they made that really easy to see where you were going. It was kind of an all-around tractor. They were a general purpose tractor. They were good for what they were good for. And like I said, a lot of people had these as their secondary tractor. Eventually, IH kind of made something to counter this, was the 300. So the 300 utility came out about the same time as the Jubilee. Honestly, I think the 300 utility is probably a much better tractor, even though it initially didn't come with a 3-point hitch. So the patents for the 3-point hitch didn't become available until later on in the 50s. IH still had their fast hitch, and Alice Chalmers had their snap coupler, which was kind of a 3-point hitch but upside down, and then everybody was trying to come up with their own version of the 3-point hitch to avoid the patent infringements. John Deere had a funky one with a funky top link. Case had the Eagle hitch. So everybody had their own hitches, and by the time the patents expired, everybody just said, screw it, we're going with the 3-point hitch, except initially IH. Until like 1955, when the 6, 7, 8, 900 series tractors came out, but they were a one tractor company, so it wasn't really a one size fits all in all cases. So there was a lot of competition. IH, when they came out with their Farmall Regular, and like I said, the 1530, which was kind of a version of this, they were losing market share. And by the late 1940s, early 1950s, International was the top seller of tractors. They had 70% of the market share, and that left 30% for the remaining. And John Deere and Ford took up a huge amount of that remaining 30%. Now that I'm back here, one of the design updates was this was changed to give you more options for the draft control. This drawbar was an updated drawbar. Initially, it just came with like a clevis underneath with a drawbar like this that went to a flat drawbar and went across for a swinging drawbar. And then there was a lockout that came from here to here and from there to there to stabilize the 3-point hitch so that it couldn't go up. I think in the Jubilee there was like some kind of chain or something they hooked to the rock shaft so you couldn't try to accidentally lift the 3-point hitch while it was locked up. But this is the updated drawbar, much better than the original one. In fact, IH had something like this with their fast hitch, and it was a whole rigmarole to switch over back to use it as a regular tractor, so they came up with this. So this was a neat little tractor, and it was pretty easily serviced, useful in most instances. Design of this tractor with the seat kind of forward of the rear axle gave for a better ride because it was in front of the axle, whereas a lot of the row crop tractors at the time, the seat was behind it, so it was a little bit more bumpy. Looks like riding in the back seat of a school bus, I guess. So that was one of the things, but the way the weight distribution of this tractor was, it kind of made it break loose when you had a heavy load on it, so people had to load the tires or add wheel weights really in order to get a lot of traction out of it. I believe the guy's name was Harold Brock, who helped design the 9N, and he stayed with Ford in the tractor division for quite a long time as an engineer and designer. And I'm moving into history, more modern history a little bit, but in the mid-50s, Ford came out with what they called the Selecto Speed, which sounded like a great idea. It's basically like an automatic transmission for a tractor, but they were really trying to push it through to get it out. So Harold Brock and his team just said it's not ready, it's not going to work, and they were pressured by executives, and they were blaming Harold Brock, saying, your guys are holding up production of this. So they pretty much let him go, and Harold Brock went on to work with John Deere with the new generation tractors. Well, it turns out that he wasn't wrong. Once these tractors started hitting the field with that Selecto Speed, they started failing. In fact, when Harold went to John Deere, I think he ordered 2 of them, and they started putting them through the John Deere field tests, and one lasted like 12 hours and one lasted like 18 before they imploded. So in concept, the Selecto Speed was a great idea, but they just didn't give it enough time in the trials and design to work the bugs out of it before they pushed it out. So it ended up being a huge failure. And even today, people, they hear the word Selecto Speed and they're like, I don't want that. Ford had pulled them all back and they fixed them. But it's kind of like IH with a 460, 560. Even though they fixed them, they had a bad name and people were mad and they started going to like John Deere or somewhere else. So Ford lost a lot of business with that Selecto Speed by pushing it out like that. So like I said, I could go on and on and on about a lot of different things about these tractors, but I'm trying to keep it to a manageable length of time. And I appreciate you watching. If you have comments or information you want to share, please put it down below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.